October 3rd, 1881, Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory. When Gideon Harrow returned to the rented cabin that evening, his belongings were already outside. A flour sack sat beside the door. A toolbox rested in the dirt. 2 wool blankets lay folded on top of a wooden chest. Someone had even carried out the cradle he had been building for a child who had not yet been born. Silas Morrow, the landowner, stood on the porch with a signed bill of sale in one hand. Another family had offered more money. The cabin was theirs now. Gideon counted what remained. $10. A few tools. A wagon too old to sell for much. Rufus, the hunting dog who never strayed far from his side, and Eliza, 5 months pregnant, standing quietly beside the road. Far above the valley, fresh snow dusted the western ridges. Winter had started climbing down the mountains. Eliza never argued. She never begged. She simply rested one hand against her stomach and watched the clouds gathering over the peaks. That silence carried more weight than any tears could have. That first night, the Harrows slept beside their scattered belongings under a canvas sheet stretched between the wagon and a cottonwood tree. Most people in Bitterroot Valley would have worried about a house. Gideon worried about firewood. Shelter for themselves was straightforward. A temporary dugout carved into the hillside for the family could be finished in a matter of days. Dry fuel was harder to replace. Once winter settled into the valley, wet wood became a slow disaster. Fires burned colder. Smoke lingered longer. Wood piles disappeared twice as fast. Years earlier, at a logging camp near the Clearwater, Gideon had watched a woodsman spend an entire season fighting damp fuel. The man never froze. He simply grew weaker as the winter dragged on. The lesson stayed with him. Cold weather was dangerous. Bad preparation was worse. While Eliza slept beneath the canvas, Gideon sat beside the wagon and studied the dark hills, already thinking about how to keep 4 cords of firewood dry through an entire Montana winter. The next morning, Gideon followed Bitterroot Creek upstream with Rufus trotting ahead through frost-covered grass. He ignored the open ground where most settlers would have built. Snow gathered there. Spring floods reached there. Wind crossed it, without slowing. About half a mile from the wagon, a different shape caught his attention. A shallow rock alcove sat beneath a sandstone ledge. The slope faced southeast, catching morning sun while remaining sheltered from the strongest winter winds. More important, the overhanging stone above showed smooth scars where years of sliding snow had passed without stopping. Rufus paused near a narrow crack in the rock and sniffed the dry earth beneath it. Gideon crouched beside the dog and studied the terrain for several minutes. The hillside had already solved half the problem. He only needed to finish what nature had started. Work began before sunrise on the 3rd day. Cottonwood grew thick along several bends of Bitterroot Creek. Most settlers ignored the younger trees. They twisted too easily, warped too easily, and looked too weak to trust. Gideon saw something different. By noon, 15 saplings lay beside the rock alcove. Each measured roughly 15 to 16 feet long and little more than wrist thick. Their leaves had already turned yellow. Frost glittered along the bark. One by one, he trimmed the branches and drove paired anchor stakes into the ground. Then came the harder part. The first sapling bent slowly, the second resisted. The third groaned loud enough to make Rufus lift his head. Gideon never rushed the process. Years of wagon repair had taught him a simple rule. Green wood bends, dead wood breaks. Each rib formed a smooth arch, stretching from one side of the alcove to the other. Another followed, then another. By late afternoon, the structure resembled the skeleton of a tunnel emerging from the hillside. Several travelers from town stopped along the creek road to watch. One man laughed. Another asked if Gideon planned to shelter rabbits inside it. A third predicted the first heavy snow would flatten the entire thing. The comments drifted across the cold air and disappeared. Gideon kept working. By sunset, 15 cottonwood ribs stood in a neat row. The arches held their shape without sagging. The curved frame seemed strangely natural against the stone, as if it had grown there instead of being built. For the first time since losing the cabin, Something solid stood between his family and the winter that was coming. Word of the unusual structure spread faster than Gideon expected. 2 days later, Caleb Rusk arrived to see it for himself. For nearly 20 years, Caleb had built livestock sheds, wagon covers, and storage barns for logging camps across western Montana. Few men in the valley understood snow loads better. He walked around the cottonwood frame without speaking. Finally, he stopped beside one of the arches and pressed a thumb into the bark. "Too soft," he said. "Cottonwood has no business holding a winter roof. One hard storm, and the whole thing folds." The criticism carried weight because it came from experience, not arrogance. Gideon listened. Then he pointed toward the sandstone ledge above the alcove. A broad white streak marked the path where previous winters had pushed snow down the slope. "It won't stay on the roof," Gideon said. Caleb followed his finger. "The snow hits up there first. Once it starts moving, it'll slide over the structure and keep going." For a moment, neither man spoke. Caleb studied the hillside again. The explanation made sense. But whether it would actually work remained another question entirely. Winter would decide that soon enough. The cottonwood ribs provided the skeleton. The next step would determine whether the structure became a shelter or remained a curiosity beside the creek. Gideon spent the following days gathering long chokecherry switches and young willow shoots from the creek bottom. Some were no thicker than a finger. Others stretched nearly 8 feet in length. Working from ground level upward, he wove them through the arches one piece at a time. The pattern was simple: over one rib, behind the next, then forward again. As the lattice tightened, the gaps between the arches slowly disappeared. Eliza worked nearby with a small knife resting across her lap. She cut willow bindings and sorted bundles by length while sitting on a folded blanket. Every hour or so, she paused to rest and pressed a hand against her stomach before returning to the task. Neither of them mentioned the baby. Neither of them talked about winter. Those concerns appeared in other ways. Gideon checked the weather whenever clouds formed over the western ridges. Eliza counted remaining food supplies more often than necessary. At night, both listened for changes in the wind. The woven walls continued to grow. By the end of the week, the structure no longer looked like a collection of bent trees. Curved lines flowed from the ground to the roof in a single shape. The hillside, the stone alcove, and the cottonwood frame seemed to belong together. For the first time, visitors stopped laughing quite as quickly when they saw it. One afternoon, a freight wagon rolled to a stop near the creek. The driver was Harlan Cho, a supply hauler who had spent years crossing mining roads, desert trails, and mountain passes from Nevada to Montana. He climbed down, studied the structure, and said nothing for nearly a minute. Most visitors formed opinions immediately. Harlan preferred observation. At last, he nodded toward the curved frame. "Stronger than people think," he said. The words carried weight because they came without enthusiasm or flattery. Then his eyes moved higher. "The willow worries me." Gideon waited. When those shoots dry, they'll shrink. Small gaps will open. Wind will find them. Moisture will find them too. He wasn't dismissing the design, he was identifying its weakest point. For the first time, someone had looked at the structure and seen the same thing Gideon saw: a workable idea that still demanded careful attention before winter arrived. The warning stayed with Gideon. Over the next several days, the woven frame disappeared beneath layers of daub made from river clay, rye straw, and fine wood ash collected from abandoned campfires. The mixture looked crude at first: wet, heavy, unremarkable. Once pressed into the lattice, it became something else. Each handful filled a gap. Each layer added mass. Wind that had once slipped through the woven walls now met resistance. The curved structure began to feel less like a shelter made from saplings and more like a permanent part of the hillside. The work demanded patience. Clay had to be packed into every opening. Larger cracks required a second pass. Areas exposed to stronger weather received even more material. While Gideon worked, Eliza sat nearby with a small notebook resting on her knee. Day 1. Outside temperature at sunrise. Day 2. Cloud cover. Wind direction. Day 3. Condition of the walls. Condition of the woodpile. The entries were simple, but they marked the beginning of something important. Neither of them intended to trust luck. If the structure succeeded, Gideon wanted to know why. If it failed, he wanted to know where. By the end of the third day, the walls had thickened noticeably. The shelter felt quieter inside. Even the sound of the creek seemed more distant. Eliza closed the notebook and looked toward the finished section of wall. For the first time since leaving the cabin, the future appeared slightly less uncertain than it had the week before, now that they had an earthen dugout for sleeping and an arched shelter to protect the wood. The first frost came without drama. By morning, the grass beside Bitterroot Creek had turned white, and a thin skin of ice held along the shallow edges of the water. Gideon reached the wood hut before sunrise with Rufus at his heels. At first, everything looked sound. Then he saw the cracks. They ran across the north wall in fine, pale lines, no wider than a knife edge, small enough for a careless man to ignore, large enough for Winter to use. Gideon knelt and touched the daub. The surface had pulled away from the willow in 2 places. Near the lower corner, the clay felt colder than the rest of the wall. Inside, the damage showed more clearly. 2 splits from the bottom row carried a faint glaze of moisture. It was not rain. It was not a leak from above. The dampness had formed where cold air settled low and met wood that had not yet fully seasoned. He carried both pieces outside and struck them together. The sound was duller than it should have been. Gideon did not curse. He did not tear the wall apart. He took Eliza's notebook from the shelf, marked the wall section, checked the wind, and measured the gap with the edge of his knife. The structure had not failed. It had told him where it was weak. For 3 nights, Gideon studied the hut after dark, when cold showed its habits more honestly. Frost gathered first near the north corner. The upper walls stayed dry, while the lower stack held the chill longer than the rest. The cottonwood ribs were not the problem. They had kept their curve and held steady under the tightening weather. The trouble lay in the skin and the air. The daub had dried too fast, then shrunk during the frost. It needed more fiber to bind it. The hut also needed a way for damp air to rise and leave before it settled back into the woodpile. By the 4th morning, Gideon had his answer. He mixed fresh river clay with rye straw, sifted ash, and horsehair traded from a stable boy in town. The new daub pulled together differently in his hands, tougher and less likely to crack. He packed it over the north wall, pressing deep around the willow. Then he cut 2 small vent gaps low near the door and 2 narrow openings high beneath the cedar bark roof. Cold air could enter where he allowed it. Damp air could leave where it wanted to rise. That evening, he checked the bottom row again. The wood felt clean under his palm. When he struck 2 splits together, the sharp sound returned. A week later, Reverend Amos Bell rode out from town and tied his horse beside the creek. The local minister had already heard about the lost cabin, the temporary dugout the Harrows were carving out to live in, and the strange arched structure growing against the hillside. He came with an offer. There would be a place to sleep in the church storage building. Food could be arranged as well. In return, Gideon would help with repairs, hauling, chopping wood, and whatever work Winter required. It sounded generous. It also came with a future already decided by someone else. Amos explained the arrangement while Eliza listened quietly from a nearby stump. She never interrupted. She simply watched Gideon, the way she always did when something important was being weighed. The minister waited for an answer. Gideon looked toward the family's half-finished living quarters in the dugout, then toward the wood hut beside the stone alcove. His hands were covered in clay. The notebook sat open on a crate. Work remained. So did uncertainty. Even so, he shook his head. Amos seemed disappointed, though not surprised. As the minister rode away, Eliza returned to her notes without a word. The decision had not made their situation easier. It had simply kept their future in their own hands. By the 2nd week of November, the structure was finally complete. The curved cottonwood ribs held steady. The reinforced clay walls had survived the first frost. Cedar bark covered the roof in overlapping layers, and the new vent system moved air exactly where Gideon wanted it to go. The total cost came to $9.35. 65 cents remained. That was all. Then the real work began. To have fuel ready for winter, Gideon couldn't rely on green wood. He scoured the timberline for standing deadwood pines that nature had already dried out over the years. For days, Gideon cut, split, and stacked firewood from dawn until fading light forced him to stop. Nearly 4 cords filled the shelter. Larger rounds formed the base. Smaller splits rested above them, with enough space between rows for air to circulate. Every piece had a purpose. Every gap had a reason. Back in the family's living quarters inside the dugout, Eliza opened the notebook and started a new section. Outside temperature, estimated moisture conditions, wood inventory, daily fuel consumption. The first entry filled only a few lines. Many more would follow. When she closed the notebook that evening, the valley had already grown quieter. Snow sat higher on the western peaks than it had a week earlier. The shelter stood ready. The woodpile stood ready. Now only one thing remained. Winter had not yet delivered its verdict. On November 27th, the sky turned the color of old lead. By noon, freezing rain began falling across Bitterroot Valley. The storm arrived quietly at first. A few drops struck the wagon, then a few more. Before evening, every fence rail carried a thin coat of ice. Tree branches sagged under the growing weight. Somewhere across the valley, a sharp crack echoed through the timber as a cottonwood limb finally gave way. The rain continued through the night, and through the next day, water froze wherever it landed. Roofs creaked, barn doors stuck shut. The storm showed no interest in stopping. Gideon made no attempt to interfere with it. Every few hours, he walked to the wood shelter, opened the door, and selected a different split from a different section of the stack. A knife blade tested the surface. His hands checked for dampness. 2 pieces were struck together, and he listened carefully to the sound. Meanwhile, inside the dugout, Eliza quietly tracked the tightening weather. 34 degrees, 31 degrees, 29 degrees. The numbers moved steadily downward. Outside, freezing rain drummed against cedar bark and stone. Inside, rows of firewood waited in silence. Nature had finally begun its first examination, and neither Gideon nor Eliza intended to miss a single detail of the result. 48 hours after it began, the freezing rain finally moved east. The valley emerged beneath a shell of ice. Fence posts glittered in the pale morning light. Broken branches littered the ground. Every step across the frozen grass produced a sharp crunch. Gideon headed straight for the wood shelter. The door opened. He paused for a moment. The packed earth floor was dry. No puddles, no mud, no dark stains along the walls. The air carried the familiar scent of seasoned wood and clay, nothing else. Still, he refused to trust first impressions. A split came from the bottom row near the north wall, another from the center, another from the upper stack, then 3 more from different locations and different heights. Each piece received the same inspection: knife blade, palm, sound. The results never changed. The wood from the center of the pile felt exactly as it had before the storm arrived. No hidden dampness appeared beneath the surface. No cold moisture lingered in the grain. Outside, countless gallons of water had fallen from the sky. Very little of it had found a way inside. Back at the dugout, Eliza listened as Gideon described each test. Beneath the weather records, she carefully finalized a single conclusion: no moisture detected. The statement occupied only 3 words. After 2 weeks of work, measurements, repairs, and uncertainty, those 3 words carried more weight than an entire page. 3 days after the storm ended, Caleb Rusk returned. This time he carried no predictions. He walked directly to the shelter, examined the roof, checked the walls, and even knelt beside the lower wood rows where moisture usually appeared first. The inspection lasted several minutes. When he finally stepped back, the expression on his face revealed the part he liked least. The structure had worked. "How much did you spend?" he asked. $9.35. Caleb stared at the shelter. The year before, he had spent $52 building a conventional woodshed for his own property. For a long moment, only the sound of Bitterroot Creek filled the silence. Then he shook his head. That cottonwood frame shouldn't be working. Gideon glanced toward the hillside. "It isn't working alone." His hand moved from one feature to the next. The sandstone ledge above, the slope that shed snow, the prevailing wind crossing the valley, the vent openings hidden beneath the cedar bark. Caleb followed each gesture carefully. At last, he nodded. The shelter had not defeated nature. It had been built to cooperate with it. That was a harder lesson to argue with. The story of the little shelter traveled farther than Gideon expected. A week after Caleb's visit, 3 miners arrived from a claim south of the valley. They spent nearly an hour walking around the structure, asking questions about materials, drainage, and airflow. A few days later, a ranching family appeared with the same curiosity. Gideon answered every question he could. He showed them how to select young cottonwood before the wood became too stiff to bend. He demonstrated how each rib was anchored into the ground. He explained why the daub needed straw and ash, and how moisture could become trapped if air had no path to escape. The conversations rarely lasted long. Most people simply wanted enough information to try the idea themselves. Money never changed hands. Instead, small trades began appearing beside the dugout. A sack of potatoes, several pounds of oats, a bundle of dried venison wrapped in cloth. One rancher left a bale of hay after noticing Rufus sleeping beside the woodpile. As November deepened, Eliza found herself rearranging shelves to make room for supplies. The food stores grew little by little, almost without notice. Nothing about their circumstances had become easy. Winter still waited beyond the mountains. Yet for the first time since losing the cabin, the season no longer looked like an unavoidable sentence. It looked like something that might be endured. December 18th arrived beneath a falling barometer. The change appeared before the storm itself. Rufus paced outside the dugout entrance. He refused to settle. Several times he stopped, lifted his nose toward the western ridges, and stared into the distance. By afternoon, snow began drifting across the valley. By evening, the wind arrived. Overnight, the landscape vanished. Trails disappeared first. Fence lines followed. Then entire hillsides dissolved into a wall of moving white. The blizzard tightened its grip and refused to leave. Day 2, Day 3, Day 4. Snow hammered the valley from different directions as gusts rolled through the passes. Barn doors froze shut. More than one traditional woodshed lost roofing boards. Heavy drifts piled against vertical walls. Moisture found its way into poorly ventilated stacks. News traveled slowly, but enough reached Gideon to paint the picture. Some families were already burning more wood than expected. Others struggled to keep it dry at all. Meanwhile, Eliza quietly managed the rhythm of their survival. Outside temperature, wind conditions, wood consumption, interior observations. Nothing was skipped. Each evening, Gideon inspected the shelter by lantern light. He checked the vents. He checked the roofline. He checked the lower rows, where moisture would appear first if the system began to fail. The storm offered no mercy. For 6 straight days, nature applied pressure from every direction. The real verdict had finally begun. On the morning of the 6th day, the wind finally began to weaken. By noon, only a few loose flakes drifted across the valley. For the first time in nearly a week, Bitterroot Creek could be heard again beneath the snow. Gideon headed straight for the shelter. This time, he didn't bother with the knife test or checking for dampness. The freezing rain last month had already proven the clay walls could hold out moisture. This test was about weight and endurance. He studied the roofline. The cedar bark groaned under a massive snow load, but the sandstone ledge above the alcove had shed the worst of the drift, exactly as intended. The 15 cottonwood ribs maintained their perfect curve. No fractures. No splintered wood. Stepping inside, His eyes went straight to the inventory, the gap where they had been pulling firewood to fight off the extreme cold for 6 days and nights. The gap was noticeably smaller than he had feared. Back in the dugout, Eliza spread her records across the table and ran the numbers. The results surprised even her. Fuel consumption during the blizzard had remained well below their original estimates. Because the wood was kept absolutely dry, the stove produced fierce heat from the moment it caught fire. Less energy was wasted boiling off trapped moisture. Less fuel vanished as useless smoke up the chimney. Compared to the figures from previous winters, the dry wood appeared to improve heating efficiency by nearly 30%. The storm had delivered its final verdict. The structure wasn't just protecting the wood. It was actively extending their survival. A week after the blizzard, a wagon appeared on the creek road just before sunset. The horses looked tired. The people looked worse. Matthias Kepler, a German immigrant who had arrived in Montana only months earlier, sat beneath a blanket in the rear of the wagon. A deep cough interrupted every attempt to speak. Beside him rode his wife, Anna, while 2 young children huddled together against the cold. Word traveled quickly in winter. Gideon had already heard pieces of their story. The storm had ruined most of their wood supply. Their storage sheds survived, but drifting snow blocked its vents. Moisture settled into the stack. By the time the weather cleared, much of the wood burned poorly. Thick smoke filled the cabin. Heat barely followed. Every fire demanded more fuel. Every day left them with less. Winter was still months from ending. That evening, Gideon visited their homestead. The evidence was easy to see. Fresh smoke poured from the chimney, yet the interior remained cold. Several logs hissed inside the stove before they finally caught flame. Matthias sat wrapped in blankets near the hearth. The scene felt familiar. Only a few months earlier, Gideon had stood beside a wagon with $10 and no shelter. The details were different, but the danger was the same. Preparation had failed. Winter had noticed. The following morning, Gideon arrived with a proposal. He spread Eliza's notebook across the table and explained that he wanted additional weather records from another part of the valley. Snow depth, temperature, wood consumption, daily observations. The request sounded reasonable, perhaps even useful. In truth, the notebook already contained more information than he needed. Anna understood that almost immediately. She also understood why Gideon had framed the offer that way. The children could help gather measurements. They could record numbers. They could assist with stacking and organizing wood. In exchange, Gideon would provide dry fuel from his own supply until a better storage system could be built. No one used the word charity. No one needed to. By afternoon, the 2 children were helping beside the shelter. One recorded temperatures, while the other measured snowfall against a marked stake near the creek. Between tasks, they carried armloads of wood toward the Kepler wagon. Anna watched from a distance. For several moments, she seemed ready to say something. Instead, she simply nodded and returned to her work. The arrangement preserved something more valuable than fuel. It allowed a struggling family to keep contributing while accepting help. Winter could take many things from a household. Gideon saw no reason to let it take their dignity as well. By the middle of January, the worst storms had passed, but winter still held the valley in its grip. The nights remained bitterly cold. Snow covered the hillsides. Ice lined the edges of Bitterroot Creek. Labor began after sunset. Eliza had known the day was approaching. Even so, the timing surprised everyone. A lantern burned inside the dugout while the temperature outside continued to fall. Rufus settled beside the entrance and refused to leave his post. Wind pushed against the door flap from time to time, but little reached the interior. The hillside blocked most of it. The stove, fueled by dry wood from the shelter, carried the rest away. Hours passed. Then, sometime before dawn, a healthy baby boy entered the world. The earthen dugout grew quiet again. Outside, the wood shelter stood beneath a thin layer of snow. Rows of seasoned firewood rested exactly where Gideon had stacked them months earlier. He stepped outside for a moment while mother and child slept. The cold struck immediately. So did the silence. Across the valley, smoke rose from scattered chimneys. into the pale winter sky. Gideon looked toward the shelter and remained there for several seconds. The dry wood, the notebook, the repairs after the frost, the measurements taken during the blizzard. Every decision had led to this morning. A child slept safely inside the earthen dugout. The shelter had begun as a way to protect Firewood. Now it stood as part of something much larger. It had helped protect a future. Spring arrived slowly in Bitterroot Valley. Snow retreated from the lower hills first. The creek swelled with meltwater. Mud returned to the wagon roads. Along the valley floor, new curved shelters began appearing beside cabins, barns, and dugouts. One stood behind a ranch house. Another appeared near a mining camp. Then another, and another. Before long, people had started calling them Harrow Arches. Gideon disliked the name. Whenever someone used it, he usually shook his head and pointed toward the nearest structure. Just cottonwood and clay. That was all he ever claimed. The explanation never satisfied anyone. Most people understood the truth already. The design had spread because it worked. What began beside a sandstone ledge with $10 and a winter deadline had become common knowledge throughout the valley. 10 years later, Bitterroot Valley looked very different. Gideon owned land of his own. A small repair shop stood near the creek road where he once searched for cottonwood saplings. The business repaired wagon wheels, farm equipment, and whatever else local families brought through the door. The Harrow household had grown as well. The baby born during that hard winter was now old enough to help split wood. More than 30 families had built some variation of the shelter after learning the method from Gideon or from someone he had taught. Success arrived gradually. The way most real things, yet among all the improvements accumulated over the years, one object remained especially important. Eliza's first notebook. The cover had faded. The corners had worn smooth. Inside remained the original entries. Temperatures, measurements, observations. Proof. Whenever questions arose, Gideon trusted those pages more than memory. They recorded exactly what winter had done and exactly how the shelter had answered. Some stories end with wealth. Others end with recognition. This one ends with observation. Many people facing the same circumstances would have searched for a bigger cabin, a larger stove, or more supplies. Gideon looked at the problem from another direction. He paid attention to where snow moved. He studied how wind crossed a hillside. He noticed what moisture could do to a woodpile long before freezing temperatures became the real danger. Those details changed everything. Nature never offered guarantees. It never adjusted its standards. Winter arrived whether people were ready or not. Yet the land always revealed clues to anyone willing to watch carefully enough. The cottonwood ribs, the clay walls, the notebook, and the dry wood were never the true lesson. They were simply evidence. The real victory belonged to a principle older than any settlement in Montana. The frontier rewarded those who learned how the world actually worked and built accordingly.